Just to provide you some context, Camden has established a members-led commemoration, memorial and street working group. The group is reviewing the names of existing buildings, streets and memorials in the borough. The group is particularly interested in memorials commemorating individuals who have directly benefited from oppression or caused significant harm to others, outweighing any contribution afforded to society. The two most striking examples are Cecil Rhodes House and Beckford School in West Hampstead. The council has considered renaming Cecil Rhodes House before recent events. The earliest discussion we are aware of took place in 1957 and more recently in 1983. However, it has been a constant issue for Camden, and we feel that now is the right time to change the name. We are also undertaking a review of all our buildings, monuments, street names. Other councils are doing the same, and in June, the Mayor of London established a Commission for Diversity in Public Realms. This includes the review of controversial names to identify those legacies being celebrated. We have a dedicated project team working on the renaming of Cecil Rhodes House and will be working closely with residents throughout each stage of the process. Just to go through the process, this is our first engagement exercise for the renaming of Cecil Rhodes House. In addition, we will also be socially distancing. There will be socially distancing drop-ins at Doreen Basil Hall at 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. on Wednesday, the 16th of September, and 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. on Saturday, the 19th of September. We invite all residents of the Goldington Estate to meet with us and find out about the plans to rename Cecil Rhodes House, but only residents of Cecil Rhodes House will be able to vote on the new name. Today's session is the start of the process to rename Cecil Rhodes House. We want to provide some context and background as to who Cecil Rhodes was, a history of the building and the surrounding areas, and issues to consider when renaming streets or buildings. We will also discuss initial proposals for new names. Following the meeting and drop-ins, a short list of names will be drawn up, which will be shared with residents. Residents will also have until September the 28th to make any suggestions for the shortlist. We will then begin consultation on shortlisted names in early October. All residents living in Cecil Rhodes House will receive a ballot and will be able to vote for their preferred names. There will also be a ballot per household. After the preferred names is chosen, there will be a 2-week consultation in November for residents to share comments and feedback. After the consultation period, the name will be changed legally and physically, and other processes such as the post office will take place, and we anticipate that this will take place towards the end of November. And when a new name is chosen, we appreciate that name changing may cause inconvenience for residents, and we are currently working on an offer to support, and we will provide when the building is renamed. As you can see highlighted on the session outline, we have a number of speakers speaking today, and I'll introduce my first speaker, Devilia Carroll, who will give her views from Goldington TRA. Devilia, are you with us on the call? You may have to unmute.
Yeah, muted myself. Well, basically, just to say that I'm the chair of the TRA. I was re-elected at our last AGM. And it's difficult to gauge opinion, but as I think I said before the meeting actually started, there is not a great deal of interest at the moment other than concern with regard to the implications of renaming it for individuals. And that's I can't say that the TRA as a group are unanimously in favour of it. I certainly understand that it isn't a question of choice. Camden are committed to changing the name, so that's fine. But they are just the issues that are operating on residents at the moment. So that's all I think I need to say. Oh, except that actually I was here in the 80s when there was a move to rename the block, but it didn't succeed. I think at that point the residents did have a choice, and I think there were a few names put forward. I know one was Mandela House, which the council didn't want for I can't quite remember the reason, and another was Robert Mugabe House, which I'm glad to say was also rejected, given the way events turned out in Zimbabwe under his leadership. I know that where we have discussed it, in terms of choosing a name, the majority are in favour of not naming it after a person, very firmly. That's it. That's all I have to say.
Thank you very much for sharing your reflections. It's interesting. It would be good to get your insight on what happened in the 80s and what were the potential barriers, but most definitely something we can pick up. I'll invite Rosemary Jenkins just to go through Cecil Rhodes and its historical impact on the indigenous people of Southern Africa. So, Rosemary, over to you.
Thank you, Hannad. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending this session. So I want to touch on Cecil Rhodes and who he was, and in particular his impact as an individual and in his role as a speculator and venturist in Africa, and what that impact led to, and then eventually his occupation as Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, and how that then went on to impact the people living in the southern areas of Africa, and parts of that which then became, as we know it today, Southern Africa. I'm as Sarah is managing my slide, I'm going to say Sarah next. So here's a very, very brief biography of Cecil Rhodes. Here he is as a man. He was born in England, in Hertfordshire, and was sent to the Cape Colony because it was suspected that he had consumption. And he did suffer ill health for the better part of his life, but his ill health didn't stop him from becoming one of the richest men as a result of his efforts in the southern parts of Africa. I think it's important to obviously just say something about his role as a miner. He established, along with others, other venturists, the De Beers mine, which had started on farmland owned by a Dutch family known as the De Beers, and when Rhodes and his associates decided to buy that land, they kept the name. And of course, that name is still with us today. Mining by that company is still something that is undertaken and carried out. I suspect the present De Beers mines are a healthier place than they were when Rhodes established them with his associates, and the conditions there were obviously quite terrible for particularly black people who were enforced in labour camps to run those. When he became Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, he did so really to further his interests as a venturist in the area, and saw that as an opportunity to use his wealth to buy up as much land through fair means or foul, and a lot of this history is recorded in a number of places, to buy up land, and that meant that he and his company occupied 100% of the mining activity in the area. But what made him stand out were the Acts of Parliament that he brought in to remove Xhosa people, and a Xhosa person is Nelson Mandela, for instance. That's how far back and even further back this group who had existed lived in South Africa. But to remove them and all black peoples from their lands, and this removed their right to vote, effectively. Not all of them, just those who could afford to buy land, which were very, very few. But as importantly, shifted many black people from their lands into around 10% of the land that was governed in the name of the British Crown. Sarah, if you can move on. So as you can see here, these are the locations that we're talking about, and the area that was known as the Cape Colony, which included Angola and Mozambique and Zambia, Zimbabwe. So it's quite an extensive area that was occupied by the British, which is shown in green here, and then other European nationalities. Sarah, if you can move on. So what we know is that Rhodes had the time to earn himself quite a lot of money, and after he did that, he came back to England to go to Oriel College, Oxford Oriel College in Oxford, where he developed his thinking, and part of that was around looking at ways in which he could develop his ability to govern, and he very much saw his role as aiming to secure as much of the land in Africa and elsewhere, and he is attributed with a quote that talks about occupying from Cairo to Cape on behalf of the English, considering the English to be a superior race to all others. And here are some of the statements that he is attributed with, which very much reflected his views, and not just his views, but the actions he then went on to take to oppress the black people that he came into contact with, and even those that he didn't, in terms of governing the whole of the area. If you can move on, Sarah. So there's more of that, which, as I've said, is really from the perspective that all others other than Anglo-Saxon, and that would be white in his view, were superior, and it was important to treat all others, as this says, by the most despicable human beings, and that it was the role of Rhodes and people like him to use black people in the way that they chose to. So then we start to see the beginnings of what are described as closed compounds, which were in effect a concentration camp for black workers. Once those black workers were taken in, they were not allowed to leave until their contracts had ended. And that meant that they were separated from their families, sometimes for years. Laws were instituted to control that labour, and what it developed into, and particularly so by 1948, was the model for apartheid, which was targeted at separating races and preventing people from intermarrying, and removing the vote from black people in South Africa. As it says, he introduced an amendment bill which permitted the flogging of black servants. And so whilst South Africa didn't have slaves, there was a sense, because there had obviously been a history of hundreds of years of slavery. At this point, because slavery had been abolished, this was an opportunity to really look to treat black people with less rights than would have been expected post-slavery. Sarah, if you can move on. And that was very much based on a sort of colonial idea of Africa and the people who lived there, and that, the African people had no history. And as these pyramids show, and that the majority of pyramids, even to this day, exist in Sudan, not in Egypt, which is everyone's one one of the most popular tourist destinations. African peoples were savages before white settlers had arrived, and that white settlers were needed to develop the lands that they occupied. And that African peoples needed to be saved by Europeans, and that, you know, the speculation and the settlers and the armies that came were the people who were doing the saving. And that as a result of African people's inability to keep control of their lands, this was quite plainly an act of God. At the time, missionaries and the Bible were very much at the forefront of leading that sense that African peoples were barbaric, and that as superior groups with access to the Bible, it was right that these lands were removed from the Africans who occupied them. Sarah, if you could move on. And so what we had after Rhodes' death and then subsequent white governments that came into being was the real development of apartheid. And what these images really highlight is this real sense that of oppression that took place. And when we hear today about walls being built to keep people out of a country, these people, African peoples, lived in these parts of South Africa. It was their land, and yet they were barricaded into areas where, on the other hand, white settlers who came were free to roam throughout the country and to live wherever they wanted, and to live freely, independently, and in some cases in luxury. That there was a sense of white people needing to be afraid, and as this sign shows, caution, be aware of natives, was this idea that, you know, every black person that white people might come into contact with would prove to be a danger to them. And then, of course, everything about the way that you lived your life was kept separate. Benches, drinking fountains, beaches, housing, shops, trains, buses. Everyone was kept separate. And I have in this, on this slide, two photographs of Nelson Mandela. One roughly at in 1961 when he was arrested and placed in jail, and the second is him revisiting that jail shortly after he had been released in 1994. So he'd spent 27 years in prison for pressing hard, being part of what was regarded as a terrorist organization, for wanting to see the provision of vote to improve living and working conditions for the people whom he not just represented, but who were the natives of the land, as this sign says, the indigenous peoples of this land. Next slide, Sarah. And here we have an example of how settlement occurred and who benefited from the land that was then carved up. And so we have a black African, South African family occupying this house. It no doubt had two rooms, possibly three at the most. As you can see, the conditions are hardly hygienic. And we have a white settler whose family may well have lived in South Africa for hundreds of years, but the benefits that were enjoyed by those settler groups totally outweighed any access to education, good housing, health facilities, etc. And I think this picture really does bring that home. And Rhodes, that idea of Africa and its peoples was still around and is to an extent still around today in 2021. Sorry, 2020. Next slide, please, Sarah. And so we've touched on already, Hannah has mentioned why it's important to us as an organisation who is a multi-ethnic organisation operating in a multi-ethnic borough such as Camden is, that we should want to ensure that our values are the values that uphold all human life, all human dignity, and that as we do so, we acknowledge that the presence of those people who set about to oppress and deprive individuals of their lives and of their well-being and those of generations of their families shouldn't be honoured in the way that Cecil Rhodes has been. And we've come to a point where we feel, in order to give everyone back, black and white, the dignity that we all deserve, that we claim to be part of in terms of upholding certain values of respect, that it's important for us to look to change this name so that the people in South Africa and here in Camden can move about the world with the dignity that they deserve. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Rosemary, for your presentation on Cecil Rhodes, really highlighting its past legacy in Africa and emphasizing why we are having these discussions and why it's so important to us as an organization and a Camden community. So thank you very much for that, Rosemary. I'm going to invite Diana Foster, who's going to give us some historical context, and she's from the Somerstown History Club, and provide a bit of commentary outlining the Rhodes connections to the area and the history of Cecil Rhodes House. So can I invite Diana?
I was muted, sorry. Hello everyone, my name's Diana. Some of you've met me, I know. I run a history club. We've been running for since 2016, actually, helped by Councillor Roger Robinson, who was very keen for a Somerstown museum. And it's interesting, I've just followed Rosemary about talking about, you know, human dignity and people who actually helped create the conditions for that. Actually, a lot of them, Somerstown has a lot of social reformers attached to it, so there's no end of choice if we're looking for great role models like Mary Wollstonecraft, who fought for women's education, and Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, of whom there is a hospital. So one of the first schools for girls was established here by the French refugees, and of course there has been waves of immigration. Somerstown History Club has done 3 publications, one of which actually the latest does talk about some of these individuals, as well as ordinary people who live in the area, of which there's a very diverse group of us. I'll hand over to Esther. I'm sorry, I'm not going to do a strictly historical review from the French onwards, but let's just say there is a rich history, and I've been very excited by this to start the club. And if anyone wants to contact us and contribute, we've done oral histories as well. And we're really kind of looking for a space for history to actually celebrate the individuals who actually did something great for human dignity. And actually a lot of them were associated in this very area, George Padmore being one, and I know, Susie, you're going to cover. But actually, Esther's not going to cover people, and I'm going to hand you over to Esther, who's much more able to explain. Because of the TRA's direction that I think you wanted it to be not named after a person, we did a little bit of research into what could be other suggestions to name Cecil Rhodes House after. And some of these are kind of to do with a river. There is actually a river running through that area. So I'm going to hand over to Professor Esther Leslie, who really I depend on so heavily for a lot of the research. So I'll hand over to Esther.
Hi, thank you, Diana. Thank you, everyone here, for inviting us along as the History Club to just have our input into these discussions, because as we know, very often it is historical figures or historical landmarks that come to name buildings. And I'm part of the History Club too, just to put that there. And as Diana said, I mean, this area within which Cecil Rhodes House finds itself is very rich in history, and we've spent years digging up things that have occurred there, people who've passed through, and so on. And I'm not going to give you a potted history of that. I was just going to focus on a couple of themes that might allow one to think of particular names or ideas that one could develop. So as Diana's suggested, I mean, one of the most important but now hidden things about the road that Cecil Rhodes House is on is the river, the Fleet River, that was, as you see in this picture here, you know, it ran in front of the old St Pancras church, which you'll notice was remodeled in the 19th century, but that's the more original version of it. It's a very bucolic scene here. Apparently, though, I mean, given the developments that happened along this road with a smallpox hospital and the workhouse and so on, it actually became quite a smelly, mucky river. But I love this picture that sort of shows people bathing within it, and this is the kind of area one could imagine William Godwin, Mary Wollstonecraft and romantics and so on wandering around by the graveyard. So we think, you know, possibly there's a strong connection to this river called the Fleet, although at this point, as it comes through, it's also known as the Wash or the Pancras Wash. And you see that's commemorated in Goldington Gardens, Goldington Crescent Gardens there. So once a floodplain for the River Fleet rising in Hampstead and then flowing all the way down to Fleet Street. So Fleet, Wash, Pancras Wash and so on could give some ideas, but also associated with that floodplain are various wells and spas that one could think of. So St Pancras Wells, so one could take that as part of a name, or just wells. Slightly further up to around King Cross, there was Bagnig Wells. One could think about the spas, one could think about London Basin. These would all be quite watery names that might give some stimulation. And also, of course, what happens to the river and why we can't see it now is it was put into a pipe called a culvert. So I wondered if that idea of culvert house or something might also have some resonances that would link to the history of the area or the landscape. Now, of course, before Somerstown was built and Cecil Rhodes House and everything, this was farmland, Brill Farm. So, I mean, that could be reflected in the building's name. And of course, the person who farmed here, the cowkeeper who owned much of the farmland, which extended right over to Hampstead Road and all around, was, I think it's Thomas Rhodes, the grandfather of Cecil Rhodes, the man in question. Thomas Rhodes had quite an influence on the area. He was overseer and director of the poor, associated with the workhouse at Goldington by the graveyard, which is part of the hospital now. Someone who, you know, founded was a trustee of the New Road, which became the Euston Road. Now, I don't think we would want to honour that Rhodes family, but maybe thinking about the farmland, And then what became of it, what made Somerstown, was the fact that all this mud and clay was taken from it to make bricks, and the origins of Somerstown, as depicted in a fantastic book by Linda Clark, Building Capitalism, which is a history of Somerstown coming into being, was all around brick making, brick speculation. So I thought maybe some of those themes could feed into something. So you could talk about brick fields, because that is what the farmland became. It produced the bricks that made Somerstown. There were also these great kilns, tile kilns for firing the bricks. So you might think about tile house, tile kiln house, or something like that. Of course, some of the byproducts of all of that were the immense dust heaps for which the area became very famous. Charles Dickens, local author, writes about those. Now, no one presumably would want to call their building Dust Heaps House or something, but there was a more romantic way of talking about that, which is Cinder Hills, which I thought had quite a nice kind of resonance to it. But so that was another feature, these sort of great hills of dust and mud and all of the aftermath of brick production in the area. And then I suppose the other area that I was thinking about as relevant to the history revolves around the kind of leisure industry, of which the spa and the wells were part of it. This led to these little pleasure gardens in the area, and also there was the place directly opposite, as far as I can work out, used to be called Eve's Place, and right next to the pub, right next to the church, Old St Pancras Church, was a pub called Adam and Eve, which maybe, or one could take other pub names perhaps. There was an incident when the fleet flooded, which it often did, and it ended up with an anchor being swept up and wedged its way in somewhere in some sort of incident. And that made me think about the local pubs, which have all but two now been lost, but have quite resonant names like the Anchor, and well, there's big long lists of those pub names that could be provided. So that might be another type of stimulation. One could go way back into the history. Of course, it was a Roman settlement. People talk a lot about the churchyard as the oldest consecrated land in Europe. So one could just think about Pancras himself, the saint after which the area is named and after which the church is named, or just acknowledge the Roman presence in the area. Or there's also, not so far away on Battle Bridge Road, Boudica. And the final area I just wanted to bring up were the sort of literary connections. I mean, it always strikes me that almost one of the most beautiful sites in London, one of the most curious romantic sites in London anyway, is in that graveyard opposite with the Hardy tree. And it wouldn't be honouring Thomas Hardy, who I'm not sure if he's a controversial figure or not, but I think it's right not to, you know, all these people have feet made of clay, but maybe honouring the Hardy tree for as long as it exists could be interesting. Or take a Dickens character who hung around the workhouse there, Oliver Twist. There's quite a tradition of sort of using literary figures for naming. So I think that was just part of the context I wanted to convey, and some of the areas that one might like to think about names from. So thank you for listening.
Thank you both, Esther and Diana. Really insightful presentation and a rich history of Somerstown. A number of interesting names that you put forward, and I'm sure that we have colleagues who are also going to be discussing a number of different people who we want to rename under. I'm going to invite my colleague Susie Plum to discuss the renaming consideration. I think it fits in well with the discussion we've had now. So Susie, over to you.
Thank you, Hannah. I hope everyone can hear me. And thank you so much, Diana and Esther, for that really fantastic presentation and look into the history of Somerstown, which is it's always a joy to hear about your work and what you've kind of unearthed about Somerstown. It's brilliant. I've got a few little maps that I kind of wanted to start off with. Of the area which I found, and I know they're a bit small, I'm sorry, but you can perhaps just about make out, I'm not sure actually, Sarah, if you can scroll in or not, but anyway, you can just about make out on this map, in the middle of the map towards the top.
I'll just say I can't, sorry, but maybe we can put them on the website so people can look at them later.
Yeah, so just towards the top of the map, in the middle of the page, there's a kind of fork in the road, and that's the fork in the road that's just above Pancras Church. And on the map you can see Pancras Church identified there. This is 1755, this map, and just next to the church, to the left of the church, you'll see Somerstown is fields, essentially, and this map indicates who owned those fields at the time in 1755, and you'll see here that it's owned by the Brewers Company. The Brewers Company was essentially a group of brewers, London-based brewers, who came together as a guild in order to promote beer and brewing and sell their wares within the City of London, and so. A man called Richard Platt was part of the Brewers Company, and he acquired this land that Cecil Rhodes House now stands on in 1575. And when he died, he gave the land in trust to the Brewers Company on the understanding that they continued to support a free grammar school in Aldenham in Hertfordshire, which he'd set up through special license from Queen Elizabeth I. So he wanted to provide almshouses and a free grammar school to local poor people in Hertfordshire. And he used the income from this land in St Pancras to pay for that school. But the Brewers Company kept that land for quite some time, and the income was used for Aldenham School for quite some time. So pasture land then sort of started being built over, but in the next slide, Sarah, you can see a little bit more clearly the church, and it's still at this time in 1795 you can see that Somerstown is starting to be built upon, down towards Brill Farm, which is in the bottom kind of right hand corner of that picture, and then towards the top you can see the fork in the road. One branches Fig Lane and the other going northwards. You can see then marked the Adam and Eve pub, which Esther just mentioned, just by the church. And on the other side of the road, again, it's just pasture land. So in 1795, there's still no building yet on that site. It's still just farmland. The next slide, Sarah, please. And you can see in 1817, this is the same map. The one on the right-hand side is just enlarged slightly. You can see Somerstown building is encroaching upwards towards Fig Lane. The church is on the right-hand side. You can see there. Funnily enough, these don't mark the course of the River Fleet, which is really interesting. I was trying to find something that marked the course of the River Fleet, but couldn't find anything. But yes, the River Fleet certainly runs sort of the length of Goldington Street, Crescent and Street. So you can see here that again, it's still in 1817 still pasture land and fields, but later on towards the I think I might have one more map actually, Sarah, I'm not sure. Yeah, here we go. So you can see later on towards the late 1800s, the buildings had already appeared, and in fact by 1890 there was an ironworks on the site, and this is a really fantastic map which you can access online, and it overlays the current site with a map from the 1890s. So you can see the church there on the right hand side, in the top right hand side of the picture, and you can see the St Pancras ironworks and the tramway, which features where Cecil Rhodes House and Chini's is. So some other names, alternative names to go alongside Esther and Diana's suggestions might be, along with Fleet, might be pasture to represent the fields and the pasture land, brewer to represent the Brewers Company and their ownership of that land, foundry to commemorate the ironworks and all the people that worked in there, or indeed Aldenham. I know we've got an Aldenham Street to commemorate the Free Grammar School in Aldenham, Hertfordshire. So I just thought those maps were really interesting to look at, to see the space where the building itself currently is and what was happening there before it was built in the 1940s. And then I've also put together a few names with discussions with lots of other people, some figures from history, and I mean we've come up with quite a diverse group of individuals to consider. But really, this is just a starting point. Really, this is just to generate conversation and discussion, and maybe some inspiration for people to go away and have a think and see if there's anyone else that you might think actually that it would be really good if it was called after them, and we can add those to long lists and so on. So this really is just to stimulate conversation and discussion, and just to bear in mind that you know, it would be great to have a few individuals' names put out there as options, but also that there are issues with that too, in that sometimes people change, and sometimes things come up through new research and new academic research into individuals, and our cultural understanding of people's ideas and philosophies also changes. So just those are just some things to think about when we're looking at possibly naming a building after an individual. But what I'm going to do is I've just written a few paragraphs for each of these individuals, so I'm just going to read those through because that's probably quickest and easiest. So I'm going to start with Claudia Jones, who was born in 1915. She was born in Trinidad into poverty and moved to the USA aged 8. Jones was a political activist, journalist, theoretician and socialist. In the USA, she campaigned against the exploitation and oppression of people, for women's rights and for world peace. Jones was a member of the Communist Party of America in the McCarthy era of the 1940s and 50s, and as a result was deported to the UK by the American government. She actively campaigned for civil rights in both the USA and the UK, and was instrumental in progressing civil rights in both countries in the 1950s and 60s. In order to give voice to Black people in this country, she founded Britain's first major Black newspaper, the West Indian Gazette, in March 1958. This newspaper had a circulation of 15,000 and was an anti-racist, anti-imperialist publication. Jones also organised the first Caribbean Carnival, which took place in St Pancras, and later paved the way for the Notting Hill Carnival. Claudia Jones lived in Lisbon Road in Camden in the north of the borough. I've got some, I can share these notes later on if anyone would like them, and there's some links through to further information. Next slide, please, Sarah. I'm just going to briefly read through a short biography of Noor Inayat Khan, who was born in 1914. She was born in Moscow in 1914, the daughter of an Indian Muslim father who founded the International Sufi movement, and American mother. They moved to Bloomsbury shortly before the outbreak of the First World War, staying here until they moved to France in 1920. After attending the University of Paris, known as the Sorbonne, Khan began a career in poetry and writing for children. When German forces invaded France in 1940, her family fled via southern France to England, arriving back in Bloomsbury and living in Taverton Street. Khan and her family were pacifists, but determined to help in bringing down Nazism. So she joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force and trained as a radio operator. In 1940, she was recruited by the Special Operations Executive as a radio operator and spy. In June, she became the first woman to be dropped behind enemy lines in France as a radio operator, a very highly dangerous job. Khan's code name was Madeleine, and she soon became known to the German forces in Paris. She evaded capture and continued to transmit messages for months before being betrayed. In October, she was captured, sent to Germany, imprisoned, tortured, and kept chained in her cell for 10 months. She was then transported to Dachau concentration camp and executed there on the 13th of September 1944. Khan was posthumously awarded the French Croix de Guerre with Silver Star and the George Cross, the second highest award of the British honours system, awarded for acts of the greatest heroism or for most conspicuous courage in circumstance of extreme danger. So she died in 1944. Next slide, please, Sarah. Moving on to George Padmore, who Diana mentioned earlier. He was born into a middle-class family in Trinidad in 1903. Padmore became a leading Pan-Africanist journalist and author. In 1927, he moved to the USA to study medicine and join the Communist Party there. He travelled to Moscow and Austria, finally settling in Germany in 1931, writing and campaigning for black workers' rights and the decolonisation of Africa. As a result, with the rise of the Nazi Party, Padmore was deported from Germany and relocated to London. Here, frustrated by the lack of support for decolonisation from Communist International, known as Comintern, Padmore stopped working with them and was subsequently expelled from the communist movement in 1934. Whilst in London, he set up the International African Service Bureau and with colleagues formed the Pan-African Federation in 1944. This group organised the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester in October 1945, which saw a set of demands and resolutions for the end of colonial rule for countries in Africa and the West Indies. This Congress was instrumental in laying the foundations for the independence and political liberation of these countries, and by 1966, all but 6 African countries had achieved this. In the late 1940s and 50s, Padmore became a political advisor to his friend Kwame Nkrumah, who led Ghana to independence in 1957. Padmore lived in Ghana for the remaining 2 years of his life, which were fraught with political disagreements with his friend, returning to London in 1959 for medical treatment, where he died of liver disease. Padmore lived in Cranley Street, Somers Town. Next slide, please, Sarah. Phil Richmond. He was born in 1963 and born into slavery in New York. The teenage Richmond was spotted fighting with soldiers by the Earl Percy, a general with the British forces in the American War of Independence. Seeing an opportunity for entertainment, Percy arranged fights between Richmond and British soldiers. Percy also arranged for Richmond's freedom from slavery, brought him to England and had him apprenticed as a carpenter and cabinet maker. Richmond married a local girl in Yorkshire in 1791, moved to London and became a famous bare-knuckle prize fighter in his 40s. He won 17 out of 19 bouts, as well as training other boxers, such as former slave and champion Thomas Molyneux, poet Lord Byron, and American activist John Neal. Richmond was also present at the coronation of King George IV as an usher. He was known as the world's first black sports superstar, and he's buried in the churchyard under Euston Station. And a final individual that we thought would be a good point for conversation is Mary Shelley, who is the daughter of William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, who Diana mentioned earlier, and Diana and Esther mentioned earlier. So Mary Shelley was born in 1797, the daughter of philosopher and feminist Mary Wollstonecraft and radical political philosopher William Godwin. She was born in 1797 in Somers Town, where the family lived at the Polygon. Her mother died of complications from childbirth within a few weeks of her birth, and her father remarried a few years later, extending the family to include 5 children. Their household was educated, political and literary, and Mary's principles from a young age were liberal, feminist and politically radical. In July 1814, Mary eloped with the married radical poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, and they travelled to France and Switzerland with Mary's stepsister, Claire Claremont, to avoid the scandal of their elopement. By September, she returned to lodgings in Somers Town with Shelley and Claremont, shunned by her family and pregnant. By 1816, they were travelling again to join the poet Lord Byron at Lake Geneva, who had been conducting an affair with Claire Claremont. It was here, prompted by Lord Byron's suggestion that they each write a ghost story, that Mary began her story Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. This developed into a novel and was published anonymously in January 1818. The novel was immediately popular and has remained in print ever since. It is regarded as one of the most influential novels of English literature. Mary Shelley continued to work as an author until her death in 1851 and is seen as one of the leading writers of the Romantic era, championing the liberal, social and political reforms of her day. So those are the individuals that we've sort of had a little think about and suggested as possible names for discussion. But it would be really fantastic to hear any other suggestions that people might have, and discussions around the site-specific ideas that Esther and myself have put forward, and also any other names that people might think of that would be good to consider. That's it. Thank you very much, Sarah, for slide control, and back over to you, Hannah.
Thank you, Susie. I would echo your point around naming a building after an individual. A number of inspirational names were put forward. We have really great links to Somers Town and neighbouring areas. Just to move on to our next section, we'll be speaking about the practical implications, and this conversation will be led by a tenancy participation team who I'll hand over to. And they'll be looking at what the residents' needs are and what would come up from renaming the building. So over to you, Sarah and Stanton.
Thank you, Hannah, and a big thanks to all of the speakers who we've heard this evening. Some really inspirational stories, presenting what is the historical and local context to this initiative. And before we go into the question and answers, and I note we haven't had any questions yet, I just wanted to re-emphasize a point that was made earlier on by Hanan in the introduction, and that is around some of the implications that we are prepared to support residents with, although we have not bottomed out exactly what that support looked like. We recognize that there is a need, and we've established that from the outset that we need to do this. We're prepared to do it, and that the authority is committed to doing so. It's a process which in some respects is uncharted, but nonetheless we've embarked on it. A lot of it can be done quite straightforwardly without much complication, but we do recognize and appreciate that getting the sign done legally and all of the physical stuff changed on buildings isn't the end of the process. Residents themselves will have in turn to make adjustments where their paperwork and addresses are concerned. And we may not know for certain what that implication may be. We recognize that too, that may cause some small inconvenience, but for a good cause. And as we have conversations internally with our partners in the emergency services and in planning to establish the right name and ensure that there's no duplication in terms of what is the final choice, we will then be able to come back to residents and say exactly what requirements will be on their part and how we can, as a local authority, support them with the need and in satisfying the changes that they need to make. And with
I just butt
that,
in and say one of the things I found really interesting at the inception of this project was to learn that the fire brigade actually have to sign off the name that we choose. So just in case of any kind of confusion with a street name or any building names nearby. So that's a consideration. But in terms of changing the name, we notify the Royal Mail, and utility companies actually have addressed this that they buy from the Royal Mail apparently. So it's up to them to actually inform themselves of the change of your addresses.